They called it just a formality. They forgot I owned the name. 30 days before a 2.8B merger, they forced me out with a smile and a severance check. But I walked away with something they didn't realize they needed to close the deal. And when they found out, it was already too late. I've always been the type of person who reads the fine print. My father, a contract lawyer for 30 years, drilled this into me since childhood. "Heather," he'd say, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "the devil isn't in the details, he's in what people assume about the details." Those words would end up saving my career and redefining my life's work in ways I never anticipated. My name is Heather Langford. Until recently, I was the founder and chief creative officer of Quantivix Systems, a cybersecurity software company headquartered in Austin, Texas. The company was my brainchild, my obsession for 7 years of my life. I'm 39 now, but when I started Quantivix at 32, I was already considered late to the startup game in an industry that worships youth. What we created at Quantivix wasn't just another security protocol, it was revolutionary. NeuroKey, our flagship authentication system, used advanced machine learning to adapt to human behavior patterns in real time, creating what we called living authentication. No more static passwords or even biometrics that could be spoofed. NeuroKey recognized how you interacted with your devices, the rhythm of your typing, the pressure of your touch, the timing of your commands, and continuously authenticated you through natural use. The name came to me during a 3-day coding marathon. I hadn't slept, surviving on cold brew coffee and protein bars. Neural for the AI backbone, Key for the access it provided, NeuroKey. I registered the trademark myself, paying the fees from my personal account. This was before our first round of funding, when we were still working out of my converted garage. The trademark was registered under my name, not the company's, a tiny detail that seemed inconsequential at the time. 4 of us started Quantivix myself. My college roommate Lena, who handled operations, Marcus, our lead engineer, and Raj, who managed business development. We were scrappy, hungry, and completely convinced we were building something that would change digital security forever. Within 2 years, we had our first major client, a financial services firm that implemented NeuroKey across their entire enterprise. 6 months later, 3 more Fortune 500 companies signed on. By year 3, Quantivix had grown to 48 employees. By year 5, we were at 236. Our Austin headquarters expanded to a gleaming 4-story building in the tech corridor. We opened satellite offices in San Francisco and Boston. The press called us the new standard in behavioral authentication and the future of frictionless security. NeuroKey became the name that opened doors, secured contracts, and eventually attracted the attention of Hyperdynex Solutions, one of the largest cybersecurity conglomerates in the world. The first meeting with Hyperdynex executives took place on a rainy Tuesday in March. I remember the conference room, all glass and brushed steel, and the way their CEO, Richard Thorne, leaned forward when he spoke about integration possibilities. "NeuroKey is exactly what we've been looking for," he said, tapping his pen against the table. "The perfect complement to our enterprise security suite." What he was really saying, we want to buy you. By this point, Quantivix had taken on significant venture capital. Our board had expanded to include representatives from our investors, and while I remained CCO, I was no longer the majority shareholder. The decision to pursue acquisition talks wasn't entirely mine, though I wasn't opposed to it. The proposed valuation of $2.8 billion was beyond anything I had imagined when we started in my garage. The negotiations continued for months. As they progressed, subtle changes began occurring within Quantivix. The most significant came in the form of Michael Brent, a seasoned executive brought in from a larger tech company to help scale operations and prepare for the next phase of growth. In other words, to make us look more corporate and less like a founder-led startup. From the beginning, Michael and I clashed, not openly, not dramatically, but in 1,000 small ways that accumulated like drops of water slowly filling a bucket. He questioned my creative decisions. He reorganized teams without consulting me. He implemented processes that slowed down our development cycle in the name of enterprise readiness. The market is changing, Heather, he said during one particularly tense meeting. What got you here won't get you there. We need to professionalize. That word, professionalize, began to appear in more and more conversations. It was a code, I realized too late, for remove the founder's influence. The meeting where they cut me out happened on a Thursday afternoon, 30 days before the merger was set to finalize. I was called into the boardroom unexpectedly. Michael was there, along with our lead counsel Jessica, and 2 board members representing our largest investors. Michael did most of the talking. The company was entering a new era. My creative vision had been instrumental in getting Quantivix to this point, but the integration with Hyperdynex required alignment of leadership structures. They were offering me a generous separation package that recognized my foundational contributions. In other words, we don't need you anymore. Take the money and go quietly. The severance was substantial $8 million, full vesting of my remaining equity, and a consulting agreement that would pay me $500,000 annually for 3 years to ensure a smooth transition. This is really just a formality. Heather, Jessica said, sliding the paperwork across the table. Nuriki will continue to grow as your legacy. You've built something remarkable. I signed the papers, not because I wanted to leave, but because I recognized that the decision had already been made. The signatures of the board members were already on the documents. My removal had been orchestrated well in advance. What they didn't know, what nobody in that room had bothered to verify, was that the trademark for Nuriki, the very heart of the $2.8 billion acquisition, was still registered personally to me, not to Quantivix Systems. In the early days, I had granted the company a usage license, but I had never formally transferred ownership. It was an oversight on their part, a critical detail buried in the history of a fast-growing startup, the kind of detail my father had taught me to notice. I didn't mention this as I packed up my office the following day. I didn't say anything as I hugged my original team members goodbye, as I handed over my security badge, as I walked through the lobby of the building with my name etched in the cornerstone. Instead, I drove home to the house I had purchased after our Series B funding. I walked past the framed magazine covers featuring Quantivix. I went to my home office, opened my safe, and took out the original trademark documentation for Nuriki. Then I called Patricia Winters, the best intellectual property attorney in Texas. They cut you out, Patricia asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. We were sitting in her office downtown, the Austin skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. After everything you built, corporate evolution, I said, trying to keep the bitterness from my voice. They needed someone with enterprise experience to take them to the next level. Patricia's eyes narrowed. She'd been practicing IP law for over 20 years and had seen countless founders pushed aside. And they didn't realize the trademark situation. Apparently not. Jessica should have caught it during due diligence, but she's relatively new. The original paperwork was filed before we could afford proper legal counsel. Patricia leafed through the documents I'd brought, nodding slowly. The license you granted Quantivix was permissive but never transferred ownership. And there's nothing in your separation agreement about intellectual property transfer. Nothing specific, just standard language about company assets. A slow smile spread across Patricia's face. Then Nuriki is still yours. And without it, their $2.8 billion merger hits a significant roadblock. I hadn't come to Patricia's office with a clear plan for revenge. Part of me still couldn't believe I'd been pushed out of my own company with such clinical efficiency. But as we talked through the options, a strategy began to take shape. The next morning, I filed paperwork to establish a new company, Langford Insight. Within a week, I had secured office space in a different part of Austin and filed updated trademark documentation reinforcing my ownership of Nuriki. I also registered several related marks that would be crucial for any company wanting to expand the Nuriki ecosystem. Patricia helped me draft a comprehensive intellectual property strategy. We documented everything the original creation of the name. All instances where I had maintained personal ownership. The limited license granted to Quantivix. We gathered emails, meeting notes, Early business plans. We created an ironclad case showing that Nuriki had always been mine. Then we waited. It took exactly 16 days for the first phone call to come. Michael Brent's name flashed on my screen as I was setting up my new office. I let it go to voicemail. His message was carefully casual. Heather, hope you're doing well. There seems to be some confusion about the Nuriki trademark. I'm sure it's just an administrative oversight. Give me a call when you get a chance. I didn't call back. Instead, I forwarded the message to Patricia. 3 more calls came that day. 2 from Michael, 1 from Jessica. I ignored them all. The next morning, an email arrived from Richard Thorne at Hyperdynex. Heather, it has come to our attention during final due diligence that there may be an issue with the Nuriki trademark. As you know, this is a central component of our acquisition agreement with Quantivix. I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter directly with you at your earliest convenience. Regards, Richard Thorne, CEO, Hyperdynex Solutions. This was what we had been waiting for. The merger couldn't proceed without clear ownership of the Nuriki intellectual property. Hyperdynex's lawyers had finally discovered what Quantivix had overlooked. I forwarded the email to Patricia with a single question. Now. Her response came within minutes. Now. I called Richard Thorne's office and was put through immediately. His tone was carefully neutral, but I could hear the tension underneath. Ms. Langford, thank you for returning my call. I understand there's some confusion about the Nuriki trademark. There's no confusion. Mr. Thorne, the trademark is registered to me personally, not to Quantivix Systems. It always has been. A brief silence. I see. And you're aware that this presents a significant issue for the pending acquisition. I am. Another pause. May I ask what your intentions are regarding this matter? My intentions are to protect what's mine. Nuriki was my creation, my vision. I named it, I built it, and I own it. Quantivix has been using the name commercially for years. There's a written license agreement, I interrupted. One that gives me full control over the trademark. Patricia Winters, my attorney, can provide you with all the documentation. Richard's voice hardened slightly. I'm sure we can come to a reasonable arrangement. What are you looking for, Ms. Langford? Compensation. A role in the merged company. Neither, I said. I'm not interested in selling the trademark to Quantivix or to Hyperdynex. Everyone has a price. Not for this, not anymore. After I hung up, I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and exhilaration. For 7 years, Quantivix, and by extension, Nuriki had been my entire life. Now I was deliberately throwing a wrench into a multi-billion-dollar deal that would have made me wealthy beyond imagination through my remaining equity. But this wasn't about money. It was about principle, about respect, about not being discarded like an outdated piece of code once my creative vision had served its purpose. The next call came from Michael Brent 2 hours later. This time, I answered. Heather, he began, his voice artificially warm. There seems to be a misunderstanding about the Nuriki trademark. No misunderstanding. Michael, I own the trademark. I always have. You were compensated very generously for your contributions to Quantivix, including all intellectual property developed during your tenure. Check the paperwork, I said. Nuriki was trademarked before Quantivix received its first dollar of funding. It's my personal property, and I only granted a license for its use. Michael's tone shifted, the false warmth evaporating. What do you want, Heather? Is this about getting more money? A board seat? What's your angle here? My angle is that you pushed me out of my own company 30 days before a major acquisition, with a smile and a severance check, and now you're discovering that you don't actually own the name that's central to that acquisition. We can make this ugly, he said. Drag it through the courts for years. No one wins in that scenario. You're right. So here's what's going to happen. Quantivix will cease using the Nuriki name immediately. You have 30 days to rebrand. His laugh was short and humorless. That's not going to happen. The acquisition is predicated on the Nuriki brand and technology. You know that. I do know that, I said. which is why you should have thought more carefully before cutting out the person who owns that brand. I ended the call and turned to look out the window of my new office. The view wasn't as impressive as the one at Quantivic's headquarters, but it was mine, completely mine. The next few days brought a flurry of communications. Jessica sent a formal letter claiming that the trademark belonged to Quantivic's under the work-for-hire doctrine. Patricia responded with documentation showing I had registered it before formally establishing the company. Michael called multiple times with increasingly desperate offers, first $500,000 for the trademark, then $1 million, finally $2 million. I refused each offer. "I'm not selling back my own mistake," I told him during his last call. "And I'm certainly not selling it to you." Then, exactly 7 days after my conversation with Richard Thorne, I received another email from him. "Heather, I would like to meet with you privately to discuss a different approach to our current situation. This would not involve Quantivic's representatives. Are you available tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.? Regards, Richard." I agreed to the meeting, which took place at a small coffee shop in a quiet neighborhood, far from both the Quantivic's and Hyperdynex offices. Richard arrived alone, dressed more casually than I had seen him before, jeans and a button-down shirt rather than his usual suit. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, after we had ordered. I wanted to speak candidly, away from lawyers and boardrooms. I nodded but said nothing. "I've been researching you," he continued. "Your background, your work before and during Quantivic's. You're not just a founder with a lucky break. You're a genuine innovator in behavioral authentication. I'm aware of my capabilities, Mr. Thorne." "Richard, please." He leaned forward. "Here's the situation as I see it. Quantivic's has the infrastructure and client base for NeuroKey. But you own the name and, from what I can tell, much of the original creative vision. The acquisition as structured cannot proceed without resolving this conflict." "That's an accurate assessment." "What if we took a different approach entirely?" Richard asked. "What if Hyperdynex worked directly with you, through your new company Langford Insight, correct, to develop the next generation of NeuroKey?" I stared at him, caught off guard. "You want to cut Quantivic's out of the deal." "I want the technology and vision that made NeuroKey revolutionary. It's becoming clear to me that both reside primarily with you, not with the company you left behind." He sipped his coffee. "Quantivic's has been less than forthcoming about several aspects of the acquisition. This trademark issue is just the most glaring example." "What are you proposing exactly?" "A development partnership between Hyperdynex and Langford Insight. Initial funding of $120 million, with a roadmap for integration that could eventually reach the same $2.8 billion valuation we were offering Quantivic's." I considered his words carefully. "And what happens to Quantivic's in this scenario?" Richard shrugged. "That's not my primary concern. Without NeuroKey, they'll need to pivot or find another buyer. But that's Michael's problem, not ours." Our coffee grew cold as we discussed details. By the time we left the cafe, we had the framework of an agreement. Hyperdynex would partner with Langford Insight to develop NeuroKey 2.0, a more advanced version of the authentication system that would integrate with Hyperdynex's extensive security suite. I would lead the creative and technical development with full resources from Hyperdynex's considerable R&D budget. Patricia worked with Hyperdynex's legal team to draft the partnership agreement. The initial funding was confirmed at $120 million, with clear milestones for additional investment. Within 2 weeks, I had signed the papers and received the first transfer of funds. Quantivic's, meanwhile, was in free fall. When news broke that the Hyperdynex acquisition had been canceled and that Hyperdynex was instead partnering with Langford Insight, a new company founded by Quantivic's ousted creator, their stock plummeted. Investors filed lawsuits against the board and against Michael Brent specifically, claiming negligence in the intellectual property due diligence. 3 members of my original team at Quantivic's reached out, asking if there were positions available at Langford Insight. Lena, my old college roommate who had been operations director, was the first. Marcus, our lead engineer, followed shortly after. Even Raj, who had become chief revenue officer and had initially sided with Michael during my removal, eventually called. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought we were doing what was necessary for the company's growth. I didn't realize we were cutting out its heart. I hired them all, not out of charity, but because they were talented and because they understood the vision behind Nuraki in a way that new employees would not." Within 3 months, Langford Insight had grown to 28 people, most of them former Quantivix employees who had either left voluntarily or been laid off as the company contracted. Michael Brent resigned from Quantivix 6 weeks after the Hyperdynex deal collapsed. Jessica left shortly after. The company announced a strategic restructuring and laid off 40% of its workforce. Their stock, once trading at $86 per share, bottomed out at $12. I took no pleasure in watching Quantivix's decline. The company had been my creation, and many good people still worked there. But I couldn't deny a sense of vindication. The board and executives who had so casually discarded me were now facing the consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, Langford Insight thrived. With Hyperdynex's resources behind us, we accelerated development of Nuraki 2.0. The new system incorporated advanced ethical AI principles, giving users unprecedented control and transparency over their authentication data. We focused on what I called empowered security protection that worked with people rather than treating them as the vulnerability. 1 year after my ouster from Quantivix, I stood on stage at the International Defense Technology Conference, presenting our new security model to a packed auditorium. In the front row sat Richard Thorne, now my partner rather than my acquirer. Behind him were faces from across the cybersecurity industry, including several former Quantivix board members who had approved my removal. The future of security isn't about building higher walls, I told the audience. It's about creating smarter gateways, systems that recognize not just who you claim to be, but who you consistently are through your natural behavior patterns. I clicked to the next slide, which displayed the Nuraki logo now registered to Langford Insight alongside Hyperdynex's corporate emblem. True security doesn't reside in code alone, I continued. It lives in the principles we defend, the boundaries we establish, and the values we refuse to compromise even when we're told it's just a formality. From the back of the room, I saw Lena smile. She knew, as did everyone who had followed my journey, that I wasn't just talking about cybersecurity anymore. After the presentation, a young entrepreneur approached me, her expression earnest. "Ms. Langford, your story is incredible, standing up to a billion-dollar corporation and winning. How did you find the courage?" I thought about the question for a moment. It wasn't courage, exactly. It was clarity. When they pushed me out, I suddenly saw with perfect clarity what truly belonged to me and what didn't. The company could be taken away, but my ideas, my vision, my name, those were mine. And I decided they were worth fighting for. Any advice for someone just starting out? I smiled. Read the fine print, own your ideas legally, not just emotionally. And remember that the same people who call something just a formality are often the ones who haven't read the details carefully enough. As she walked away, Richard approached. Impressive presentation. The development timeline for Nuraki 2.0 is ambitious. But achievable, I replied. We're already ahead of schedule on the adaptive learning module. He nodded, glancing around the crowded reception area. I heard Quantivix is being acquired by Meridian Tech. Fire sale price, less than a tenth of what we offered. I hadn't heard, I said, though I had. The tech industry was small, and news traveled fast. Michael Brent is starting a new venture capital firm, Richard continued, focusing on founder-led startups with acquisition potential, ironically enough. Well, he certainly learned what not to do. Richard laughed. Indeed. The hard way. He raised his glass slightly. 2 expensive lessons and new beginnings. I clinked my glass against his. To owning what's yours. Later that evening, I returned to my hotel room and checked my email. Among the usual business correspondence was a message from my father. The subject line read simply, "Proud of you." I opened it to find a news article about Langford Insight's partnership with Hyperdynex, along with a brief note. Heather, as I've always said, the devil isn't in the details, he's in what people assume about the details. You saw what they missed, and you stood your ground. That's my girl. Love. Dad. I smiled as I closed the laptop. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more development challenges, more steps toward building the security system I had envisioned all those years ago in my garage. But tonight, I allowed myself to savor the journey from founder to outcast to phoenix rising from the corporate ashes. They had called it just a formality when they pushed me out. They had forgotten that I owned the name that made their $2.8 billion deal possible. They had assumed I would sell it back when they realized their mistake. They had been wrong on all counts. In the tech world, people often talk about disruption as the highest virtue, the ability to upend established systems and create new paradigms. What they don't mention is that sometimes the most powerful disruption comes not from a new technology, but from a simple refusal to accept the status quo. From one person standing firm and saying, "This belongs to me, and it is not for sale." That night, I slept better than I had in years, secure in the knowledge that Nuraki, my creation, my vision, my name was exactly where it belonged, with me. The next morning brought news that Quantavix had officially accepted Meridian Tech's acquisition offer, $268 million, less than 10% of the Hyperdynex deal. Several financial analysts were calling it the trademark blunder of the decade. One particularly scathing article in Tech Insider detailed how a single overlooked legal document had cost investors billions. I didn't dwell on Quantavix's fate. My focus was on Langford Insight and the future of Nuraki. We were expanding rapidly, with new offices planned in Boston and San Francisco, ironically, the same cities where Quantavix had established satellite locations during its growth phase. Richard Thorne had become not just a business partner, but a mentor of sorts. His experience navigating the corporate landscape complemented my technical and creative abilities. Where I saw possibilities, he saw pathways to implementation. Where he identified market needs, I developed innovative solutions. 6 months after the Defense Technology Conference, we launched Nuraki 2.0. The system immediately garnered attention from government agencies, financial institutions, and healthcare providers, all sectors where security breaches could have catastrophic consequences. What set our new system apart wasn't just its advanced technology, but its ethical framework. Unlike our competitors who collected and stored massive amounts of behavioral data, Nuraki 2.0 processed authentication locally, giving users complete control over their digital identity. We called it sovereign security protection that respected individual autonomy. The approach resonated in a market increasingly concerned about privacy. Within 3 months of launch, we had signed contracts worth over $400 million. Industry publications praised the system as revolutionary and the new gold standard in ethical cybersecurity. Michael Brent, true to Richard's information, had indeed started a venture capital firm. He named it Phoenix Ventures, an ironic choice given that I was the one who had risen from the ashes of his decision. In a tech magazine interview, he spoke about lessons learned and the importance of proper IP due diligence, without ever mentioning me or Quantavix by name. Jessica, the former legal counsel who had failed to identify the trademark issue, had moved to a smaller firm in Chicago. She sent me a brief email one day, months after everything had settled. Heather, I made a critical error in not verifying the Nuraki trademark status. It was a professional failure that I regret deeply. You deserved better legal representation and better treatment from the company you founded. I've learned from this mistake and am committed to ensuring it never happens again in my practice. Sincerely, Jessica Reynolds. I appreciated her accountability, rare in an industry where failures were often buried or reframed as pivots. I replied with a brief acknowledgement and wished her well in her new position. As Langford Insight continued to grow, I became more deliberate about the company culture we were building. Every employee, from engineers to administrative staff, received equity. Our board included technical experts as well as business leaders. Most importantly, Our company bylaws included explicit protections for the creative vision that had founded the company, my vision. We're building something different here. I told our team during an all-hands meeting. Not just different technology, but a different way of running a technology company. One where innovation is valued over politics, where creators are respected rather than exploited, and where ownership means something beyond a line on a balance sheet. Lena, now our Chief Operations Officer, had implemented management structures that supported collaboration without bureaucracy. Marcus led our engineering team with a focus on ethical development practices. Raj had rebuilt our sales approach around long-term partnerships rather than quick contracts. Together, we were creating the company that Quantivix could have been, should have been before short-term thinking and corporate politics had derailed it. 2 years after my departure from Quantivix, Langford Insight was valued at $3.4 billion, exceeding the original acquisition offer that Hyperdynex had made for my former company. We had grown to over 300 employees across 3 cities. NeuroKey had become the industry standard for advanced authentication, with implementations in 12 countries. I still kept the original trademark documentation in my office safe, not because I feared losing ownership again. Our legal protections were now ironclad, but as a reminder of how a single overlooked detail had changed the trajectory of my career and created an entirely new corporate success story. In a strange way, I had Michael Brent to thank for my current success. Had he not pushed me out of Quantivix, I might never have discovered the full value of what I had created. I might have remained just one executive among many. My ownership of NeuroKey, a technical footnote rather than the foundation of a new enterprise. The tech industry moves quickly, and memories are short. By the 3-year mark, many had forgotten the details of the Quantivix collapse as it had come to be known. Meridian Tech had absorbed what remained of the company, retaining some technologies but discarding the brand entirely. The Quantivix name existed now only in business school case studies about the importance of intellectual property due diligence. NeuroKey, meanwhile, continued to evolve. Version 3.0 incorporated quantum-resistant encryption and expanded beyond traditional computing devices to secure everything from autonomous vehicles to medical implants. Our partnership with Hyperdynex had deepened, with Richard Thorne becoming a trusted advisor and advocate. You know, he said during one strategy session, when I first approached Quantivix about acquisition, I was primarily interested in the technology and client base. I saw NeuroKey as a product to acquire, not a vision to support. And now, I asked, now I understand that separating the creator from the creation diminishes both. He smiled. It's been enlightening to work with someone who refuses to be diminished. That refusal to be diminished, to be discarded, to sell what was rightfully mine had defined the past 3 years of my life. It had transformed me from a founder mourning a lost company into a leader building something far more significant. On the 4th anniversary of my departure from Quantivix, I received an email from one of the board members who had approved my removal. He was now retired from the venture capital firm he had represented. Heather, time brings perspective. Looking back, I can now see that our decision regarding your role at Quantivix was perhaps the most costly mistake I made in my 30-year career. We valued structure over vision, predictability over innovation. We thought we were professionalizing the company, when in fact we were removing its heart. What you've built with Langford Insight is remarkable. More than the financial success, you've created a model for how technology companies can operate with integrity and purpose. I won't ask for forgiveness. Some errors are too significant for that, but I wanted you to know that your success has not gone unnoticed, even by those who once underestimated you. Regards, William Hargrove. I didn't respond. Some acknowledgments come too late to merit engagement, but I did forward the email to my father, who had always believed in me even when the business world had not. His reply was characteristic in its brevity and wisdom. Success is the best response to doubt. You've answered eloquently. As Langford Insight entered its 5th year, industry analysts began speculating about our future. Would we go public? Would we be acquired? Would we expand into new security domains? The truth was simpler than any of their theories. We would continue building technology that reflected our core values: autonomy, transparency, ethical innovation. We would grow at a pace that maintained our culture and vision. And we would never forget the lesson that had launched our company: ownership matters in all its forms. During a keynote address at the annual Cybersecurity Summit, I shared this philosophy with the audience. True security isn't just about protecting data or systems. It's about protecting values. It's about knowing what you stand for and defending it, whether against external threats or internal compromises. The most sophisticated authentication system in the world is worthless if we don't first authenticate our own principles. In the front row, as always, sat Richard Thorne. Next to him was my father, visiting from Florida to see me speak. Behind them were hundreds of security professionals, entrepreneurs, and investors, including, I noticed, Michael Brent. His presence surprised me. We hadn't spoken since the collapse of Quantivix. After my presentation, as attendees mingled during the reception, he approached cautiously. "Heather," he said, extending his hand, "congratulations on your success." I shook his hand briefly. "Thank you, Michael. Your work with NeuroKey 3.0 is impressive. The quantum encryption architecture in particular." "That's mostly Marcus's design," I said. "He's always been brilliant with forward-looking security models." Michael nodded, a flicker of regret crossing his face at the mention of the engineer who had followed me from Quantivix. "I've been following your company's growth. The industry needs more leaders with your conviction." "Is that what we're calling it now? I believe you once referred to it as stubborn resistance to necessary change." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "I was wrong about many things." "Yes," I agreed. "You were." An awkward silence fell between us. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. "My new fund is looking at early-stage security startups. If you know of any promising teams, especially founder-led ones, I'd appreciate an introduction." The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had pushed me out of my founder role was now actively seeking founders to invest in. "I'll keep that in mind," I said neutrally. After he walked away, Richard approached. "Was that Michael Brent?" "Yes." "Bold of him to show his face here." I shrugged. The tech world is small, and he's reinvented himself as a champion of founders now. Richard shook his head in disbelief. The ability of people to rewrite their own histories never ceases to amaze me. "It doesn't matter," I said. "The past is fixed. What matters is what we're building now." What we were building was indeed remarkable. NeuroKey had expanded beyond authentication into what we called contextual security systems that adapted not just to user behavior, but to environmental conditions, threat landscapes, and usage patterns. Our technology was securing everything from voting systems to power grids, from financial networks to medical devices. Langford Insight had grown to over 500 employees, with offices in 5 cities across 3 countries. Our valuation had reached $5.2 billion, nearly double the original Quantivix acquisition offer. More importantly, we had maintained our founding principles through this growth: ethical innovation, user autonomy, creator respect. 5 years to the day after I'd been removed from Quantivix, I stood in my office looking out at the Austin skyline. The view was different now. My new headquarters was taller than the old Quantivix building, which had since been renamed after Meridian Tech's acquisition. Lena knocked on my door, entering with a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. "Happy anniversary," she said, popping the cork. 5 years since the best worst day of your career." I laughed as she poured. "Is that what we're celebrating?" "We're celebrating that sometimes getting pushed out is actually being set free." She handed me a glass. "To liberation disguised as rejection." We clinked glasses. "To ownership," I added, "in all its forms." As we sipped champagne, I reflected on the journey, from a startup in my garage to a billion-dollar company, from being forced out to founding something better, from losing what I thought was everything to gaining what I never knew was possible. The trademark document for Nuriki still sat in my office safe, a reminder of how a single detail, overlooked by others but carefully preserved by me, had changed everything. Not just a name, but the ownership of that name. Not just a company, but the vision behind it. They had called it just a formality when they pushed me out. They had forgotten that I owned the name that made their merger possible. They had walked away with what they thought was everything of value. But I had walked away with something they didn't realize they needed. And when they found out, it was already too late. The security I had created wasn't just in the code of Nuriki, it was in knowing, with absolute clarity, what was mine and refusing to let anyone take it away.